Hello, I'm Kim Blevins-Releva, Program Coordinator for the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm joined by my colleague Jamil Miller, also Program Coordinator in Levine, to discuss the museum's guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust.
The guidelines were created to answer frequently asked questions teachers have about teaching the Holocaust. But the guidelines also reflect approaches appropriate for effective teaching in general. Let's start with what they specifically address about Holocaust education.
Sure. Well, we know that when teachers teach about the Holocaust, they want to be respectful of the memory of the victims and survivors and mindful of historical accuracy. These guidelines are useful in helping teachers evaluate resources because there's a lot of Holocaust educational content out there, and it's important to vet what you choose to use. The guidelines also shape how content is presented in the classroom, and they are useful tools to really frame any historical inquiry. They emphasize anchor historical thinking skills like chronological thinking, comparison, analysis, and research. And they also rely on top-line English skills like listening and reading and writing. And within the framework of these guidelines, there's lots of room for teachers to individualize their approaches to meet their unique classroom and individual student needs. There is more than one way to teach about the Holocaust effectively and responsibly.
Absolutely. Great points, Kim. The first guideline is define the term Holocaust. Definitions are important. They provide clarity for deeper understanding. The museum defines the Holocaust as the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial and biological inferiority. Roma, people with disabilities, and some of the Slavic peoples, Poles, Russians, Soviet POWs, as well as Black people. Other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds. Among them were communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and people we would now identify as members of the LGBTQ+ community.
That's right. And this distinction that the Nazis only targeted Jews for complete annihilation because of who they were is an important cornerstone of the museum's definition of the Holocaust. But the museum recognizes there are many groups who were targeted during the era of the Holocaust for varying reasons. Some individuals and groups were considered undesirable and enemies of the state. Once the voices of political opponents were largely silenced, the Nazis stepped up their terror against other groups of people they considered outsiders, people who didn't fit into a vision of a Nazi national community.
And just because we now know the ending doesn't mean that it had to end that way or that it even had to happen at all. That's the reasoning behind the second guideline. The Holocaust was not inevitable. History isn't a succession of facts marching to a settled outcome.
That's so true, Jamil. History really is the story of choices people make. People made choices throughout the era of the Holocaust that allowed it to take place. It was a systematic process in which many people were involved along the way, making choices. Choices to enact legislation, choices to follow those laws, choices to take individual initiative, or to allow persecution to happen at every stage.
And recognizing and unpacking historical hindsight is absolutely critical. Understanding human behavior and the complex circumstances that people found themselves in the past is an essential part of historical comprehension. Again, this extends to other history as well. People always make choices.
That's right. And this type of critical thinking helps students avoid simple answers to complex questions. This is the third guideline, and it acknowledges that the Holocaust is a complicated, nuanced historical event. Simple answers to questions should always be unpacked. Encourage your students to analyze cause and effect relationships, understanding that events usually have multiple causes.
Most definitely. Often when discussing the Holocaust, people are categorized as victims, perpetrators, bystanders or witnesses, and rescuers. It might seem logical and easy to just categorize people this way, but to get at the complexity of the Holocaust, we have to acknowledge that human behavior is fluid.
That's absolutely right. During the course of the war, an individual might fit into different categories at different times. An individual could be a helper or a witness at one time, or someone who just did their job and contributed indirectly. This new approach is really influenced by the shift in focus from the Nazi officials and those in power to include the role played by ordinary people during the Holocaust.
And recognizing that people don't fit into one tidy category, that human behavior is complicated, fluid, and that individual choices play a critical role in history encourages historical comprehension, understanding that people were human beings with personal motives for their behavior. They had hopes, fears, strengths, and weaknesses.
And reducing people to one category is an oversimplification. Simple answers mask the nuances of history and lack precision. The fourth guideline is to strive for precision of language. Precise language is critical when discussing history. It encourages us to not oversimplify and to focus on important, precise details. Incorrect terminology is historically inaccurate and it breeds misunderstanding and confusion. So, for example, the Nazis established killing centers for mass murder. Killing centers had the primary purpose of killing almost everyone who was sent there. You might also see them referred to as extermination camps or death camps. Nazi concentration camps, by contrast, served primarily as detention and labor centers. To be clear, concentration camps were still horrific places, and many prisoners died of disease, starvation, overwork, or were murdered individually as well.
And careful attention to language is essential to reading and writing goals in the classroom. The next guideline, to strive for balance in whose perspective informs your study of the Holocaust. Ask educators to consider their sources.
That's right. Educators should carefully consider the source of historical information and then the perspective it brings to the study. The Holocaust is the most well-documented genocide in world history, but the vast majority of documents and photos come from the perpetrators' records and not from individuals who are persecuted.
Because most of the documentation comes from the perpetrator's perspective, many photos are graphic and humiliating images and not how people will want to be seen or remembered. Before using a graphic image, ask yourself, is there another photograph that you can use? Could you select a photo that suggests the same magnitude of loss by showing items that belong to the victims or reading something in their own words like a diary or a letter?
Absolutely, Jamil. It's also so important to balance these Nazi sources with primary sources that tell the stories of individuals that humanize them in the richness and fullness of their lives.
Human beings always deserve this respect, and in striving to create a safe learning environment for all students, graphic images of any kind should be carefully considered before sharing. It is important that you include these personal stories in your classroom and to not forget that there are people still alive for whom the Holocaust is not just history, but their life story and that of their families as well.
That's so true. And sharing survivors' stories with respect is critical. And these primary source accounts promote historical comprehension, analysis and interpretation, as well as listening and reading comprehension.
The sixth guideline asks us to avoid comparisons of pain.
That's right. It's possible to discuss the experiences of various groups throughout the war without comparing their suffering. It is a historical fact that the Nazis and their collaborators in countries all over Europe targeted different groups for various reasons throughout the war.
Understanding the historical background of these situations is important. And as is sharing with the students that it does not mean we are attempting to determine whether one group suffered more than another.
And an important distinction should be made between making historical comparisons and making comparisons of pain. Historical connections are what makes history relevant for us today. It shows that students are thinking critically and making connections. You should examine the events of the past and think about what led up to them, what might have been done differently to resolve problems. What alternative actions might have been taken? What can we learn about how people made decisions to do the things they did? Your students can be encouraged to think about how events in the past may be shaping our present.
The next guideline asks us to avoid romanticizing history. We know most individuals in occupied Europe did not actively collaborate in Nazi genocide, nor did they do anything to help Jews and other victims of Nazi policies. Less than 1% of the population actively aided Jews during the Holocaust. and overemphasizing rescuers gives students a skewed and imbalanced picture of the Holocaust.
Unfortunately, that's right, Jamil. People who rescued Jews during the Holocaust or joined the resistance did so at great personal peril. But it's important to remember that these stories are the minority and must be kept in perspective. It's vital to examine the circumstances surrounding individuals that chose to act as well.
To fully understand the events of the Holocaust and the choices that individuals and institutions made, details of accurate historical context should be provided. That's the intention behind the 8th guideline: contextualize the history.
That's right. The museum first and foremost recommends contextualizing the history through the use of artifacts and primary sources, which are the evidence of what took place during the Holocaust. This approach also aids in meeting state and national teaching standards, which endorse the use of primary sources.
It is especially important to provide this historical context for literature utilizing your classroom. If your students read Anne Frank or Knight, consider the context that you need to provide in order for the student to understand the greater scope of the Holocaust and how the book fits into this bigger picture. And it is especially important that students can differentiate between historical facts and historical interpretations.
Providing context really helps with that. The 9th guideline asks us to translate statistics into people. The sheer number of victims of Nazi persecution and murder can be overwhelming and difficult to comprehend. When we talk about 6 million Jewish victims, what do you want your students to know and understand about that number?
Do you want your students to visualize what 6 million looks like? Or would you rather have them think critically about individual experiences?
And using diaries, memoirs, oral history testimony, and artifacts representing individuals will provide your students with the first-person perspective necessary to formulate historical questions, analyze, evaluate, and contextualize historical data, and allows students to present history in a meaningful form.
And this leads us to the 10th guideline, which is make responsible methodological choices. This overarching guideline helps set the boundaries for individual classrooms, and this guideline really starts with rationale. Why are you teaching the Holocaust, and how will you present it to your students?
Rationale is so important, and the museum has a guide to thinking about rationale and a rubric to assist you in evaluating resources. Taking time to consider your rationale, why you're teaching about this, and your unique classroom community will help you make the right choices for your students. But there are some methods not recommended, right, Jamil?
That's exactly right, Kim. For example, the museum doesn't endorse simulations of any kind that attempt to convey the suffering or horror that victims experience. It's not possible to recreate the horrific situations victims of the Holocaust endured. And even if it was, would you want your students to experience that?
That's right. Good history seeks to understand the motivations of those in the past and requires understanding the historical context the events of the Holocaust occurred in. While this may seem simple enough, the process of avoiding present-day thinking and understanding the context of an event in the past involves higher-order thinking skills that can't be conveyed in a simulation.
Definitely. Select lessons and resources that do not exploit your students' emotional vulnerability or that might be construed as disrespectful to the victims themselves.
The actual history and the actual historical documentation available, this provides the details to engage students. Encourage your students to hear the voices of survivors and the victims. They can speak for themselves. There's no need to try and force an emotional response to this history or expect that one is necessary. Everyone processes this information differently, and you're likely to see a wide range of awareness, of interest, and emotions from your students, rather than a universal emotional response. Expecting this can provide a more accurate barometer of student understanding.
Absolutely, and teachers face enormous challenges already, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is grateful that you are committed to teaching about the Holocaust. These guidelines are meant to inform your choice of resources and methods as you enter into your Holocaust units of study.
So even if you look at all of these guidelines and you think to yourself, I've done this or I've been guilty of that, it's okay. As a former classroom teacher myself, I've made many of these mistakes in my own classroom.
Absolutely. And we all believe in the importance of quality education and the impact that it has on our students.
It's really a process, isn't it, Jamil? We're all learning this together. And I saw the impact on my teaching when I applied the guidelines in my classroom.
Absolutely. And let's return to how these guidelines can support teaching about other histories as well. All history is difficult history, depending on whose perspective it comes from. There is no easy history. Defining terms, recognizing that history is not inevitable, avoiding simple answers to complex questions. All of this can help you thoughtfully consider how you're presenting historical content.
Being precise with language, balancing perspectives, not comparing pain and suffering. All of this is part of good history education.
And taking care to not romanticize history, providing context for information, and translating statistics into people. All of this can be considered in every history classroom. And these guidelines support historical thinking skills that anchor curriculum and drive standards.
Making responsible methodological choices begins with thinking about why you're teaching a subject in the first place, and then making informed decisions about how you will engage the students in the information. All museum lessons and resources are created with the guidelines in mind, which make them an excellent fit for meeting top-line anchor skill goals across the curriculums. The guidelines are what the name states, a guide, to assist teachers in designing and delivering quality instruction. And quality instruction about the Holocaust allows students to be challenged by this catastrophic event of the past. That is what good history education does. It doesn't preach, it teaches. It engages at a personal level. It promotes self-reflection and critical thinking about the world and your own roles and responsibilities in it.